The boy from Liverpool, the sound of rain tapping against cobblestones, filled the narrow streets of Liverpool in October 1940. The world was at war, bombs thundered overhead, and in the middle of that chaos, a child was born. His name was John Winston Lennon. Few could have guessed that this fragile boy, born in the shadow of sirens and destruction, would one day become the voice of an entire generation, a voice for peace in a violent world. But his beginning was anything but peaceful. John's father, Alfred, was often absent, a sailor who disappeared for long stretches of time. His mother, Julia, was full of laughter, music, and a spirit that didn't fit the grey, bombed-out streets. Yet Julia's free-spirited nature clashed with the stability a child needed. And so, John found himself handed over to his Aunt Mimi, a strict woman who ruled with order, rules, and silence. Inside Mimi's tidy house, John felt both safe and trapped. He longed for the warmth of his mother's laughter, yet he received discipline and coldness instead. That contradiction between freedom and restraint, chaos and control, would shape his soul forever. At school, John was restless, mischievous, constantly sketching cartoons instead of studying. Teachers called him a troublemaker. But behind those sarcastic eyes, behind that sharp tongue, there was a boy aching to be seen, aching to make sense of a world that had already taken so much from him. Music entered his life like a secret door opening. Julia, though distant, placed a banjo in his hands and showed him a few chords. With each strum, John discovered a new way to speak, louder, clearer, more powerful than words ever could. Liverpool was rebuilding itself after the war, but for John, the rubble wasn't just on the streets, it was inside him. Abandonment, love, discipline, rebellion, all mixed together. He was becoming something different, something dangerous, something that could not be contained. And yet, in that restless boy, a spark was forming. When destiny wrote a song that would soon collide in the mid-1950s and was a city still carrying the scars of who would change music. The air smelled of coal smoke. This is the streets echoed with the rhythm of factory workers' boots. A boy and the sky in the seemed permanently grey, already dreaming of something more. Yet within that heaviness, in the next chapter, sound was slipping through radios and record shops, and together they will create a sound untamed. The world had Elvis Presley's howl, Chuck Berry's racing guitar, what comes next, Little Richard's wild Subscribe now and join us on this journey into the those voices of John Thunder from across the ocean. John Lennon was one of them. With a cheap guitar in his hands, he found a language that made more sense than the words of teachers or the rules of Aunt Mimi. Every chord was rebellion, every lyric an escape. With a few schoolmates, he formed a small skiffle group called the Quarrymen. They weren't polished, but they were loud, and John, half smirking, half sneering, stood at the center, already commanding attention. On July the 6th, 1957, fate came quietly, disguised as a summer church festival. The Quarrymen played on a makeshift stage in the garden of St. Peter's Church. Among the crowd was a boy not much younger than John, Paul McCartney. Paul listened closely, noticing John's rough edges, the swagger in his voice, the way he bent songs into something his own. After the show, a friend introduced them. Paul picked up a guitar and played for John. His fingers moved with precision, his chords clean and confident. John, who had built his music on instinct and chaos, was struck. Here was someone who could do what he couldn't, someone who balanced his fire with discipline. In that unlikely meeting, something rare was born, a partnership that would shape the future of music. The two began spending evenings together, trading songs, scribbling lyrics in worn notebooks, daring each other to push further. John brought the bite, the rawness, the unpolished truth. Paul brought structure, harmony, and an instinct for melody. Together, they created a sound greater than either could alone. But for John, music was more than chords and rhymes. It was survival. It was the only place where the loneliness of being abandoned by his father, the ache of living away from his mother, the confusion of his youth, all of it could transform into something powerful. When he sang, the pain turned into electricity. When Paul joined in, it became something eternal. What began as two boys sharing songs after a church fair was about to ignite into a storm. A storm that would sweep through Hamburg's clubs, America's airwaves, and finally, the entire world. John Lennon had found his counterpart. Paul McCartney wasn't just a friend, he was the missing piece. Soon, two more would join them, and together, 4 young men from Liverpool would set off on a path no one had dared to imagine. In the next chapter, you'll witness the birth of the Beatles. Stay with us, subscribe, and step into the heart of the story. Forged in the fire of Hamburg, by the end of the 1950s, John Lennon and Paul McCartney were no longer just two boys strumming in Liverpool bedrooms. They had pulled in a quiet, talented guitarist named George Harrison and a steady rhythm player, Stuart Sutcliffe. Together, they carried their instruments like weapons, chasing a dream no one else could see. But Liverpool was too small, too ordinary to hold them. Opportunity came in the form of a deal, a string of nights in Hamburg, Germany. For most, it was just another gig. For John, it was something more. It was escape, it was chaos, it was freedom. Hamburg was a city that never slept, a city of sailors, smoke, neon lights, and temptation. The Beatles, still rough and nameless to most, were thrown into the clubs of the Reeperbahn, where the audience didn't care about teenage dreams. They wanted energy, they wanted madness, they wanted blood. John gave it to them. He shouted, he howled, he bent his guitar into sounds that scraped against the night. The sets lasted for hours, sometimes all night long, until their fingers bled and their voices broke. Cheap beer, pills passed in dark corners, the haze of exhaustion. This was the furnace where boys were burned down and rebuilt into something harder. It wasn't just music, it was survival. Drunks threw bottles, fights broke out, police raided the streets. And yet, on those dimly lit stages, something was happening. The band was becoming tighter, louder, unstoppable. Hamburg was stripping them down and sharpening them into a single blade. But it wasn't without loss. Stuart Sutcliffe, John's closest friend, was drifting away. He had fallen in love, had chosen art and passion over the band. John laughed it off in public, but inside he felt abandoned all over again. His life was already marked by people leaving him, his father, his mother, and now one of his brothers in music. That wound would never fully heal. Still, the fire burned. Hamburg gave John a taste of what was possible, a stage where his voice could shake the walls, an audience that demanded everything he had, and a brotherhood, fragile, imperfect, but real. And yet, something was still missing. A heartbeat, a rhythm that could carry them across the world. That heartbeat would come soon, in the form of a drummer named Richard Starkey, Ringo's star. And with him, the Beatles as the world knows them would finally be born. Hamburg had transformed them from boys into a band, but the world had not yet heard their name. In the next chapter, the missing piece arrives. The Beatles take shape, and their sound begins to echo far beyond the smoky bars of Germany. Don't miss it. Subscribe now and witness the birth of a revolution. The world learns their name. By 1962, John Lennon was no longer just a restless boy from Liverpool. He was standing at the center of a band that had survived the fires of Hamburg, a band that had bled and broken themselves night after night on smoky stages. But something was still incomplete. The sound wasn't whole. That's when Richard Starkey, Ringo Starr, walked in. With his steady hands and easy grin, Ringo brought more than rhythm. He brought glue. His drumming wasn't flashy, but it had a heartbeat, a pulse that turned chaos into music. For the first time, John, Paul, George, and Ringo stood together as one. The circle was closed. And then came the chance they had all been waiting for. A contract with a record label. A man named Brian Epstein, sharply dressed and quietly ambitious, had seen them play at the Cavern Club back in Liverpool. He saw what others missed, that behind the leather jackets and sneers was something unstoppable. He cleaned them up, sharpened their image, and put them in front of the world. The first recordings were raw, nervous, but then it happened. Love Me Do, a simple song, a harmonica riff, a chorus sung by young men who didn't know yet that they were about to change everything. It climbed the charts. It announced them. It carried their name across Britain. The floodgates opened. Crowds began to swell outside theaters. Girls screamed so loud, the music could barely be heard. Headlines shouted a new word that captured the madness: Beatlemania. For John, it was intoxicating. Fame came like lightning, sudden and blinding. He walked through airports with thousands screaming his name, his face plastered on magazines, his words turned into gospel for millions of young fans. Yet, beneath the smiles and the sharp wit in interviews, John was uneasy. He had dreamed of being seen, of being heard. Now the whole world was watching, and he wasn't sure if they loved him or just the image of him. Still, there was no time to stop and think. The storm was too strong. The Beatles were no longer just a band, they were a movement. And at the front of that storm, John Lennon was both leader and prisoner. The Beatles were no longer chasing fame, they were drowning in it. And for John Lennon, the question was no longer whether the world would listen, but whether he could survive the weight of being its voice. In the next chapter, Beatlemania reaches its breaking point, and John begins to search for something deeper. Stay with us, subscribe, and continue the journey. Drowning in Beatlemania, the roar was deafening. Airports became war zones, train stations turned into riots, theaters shook with screams so loud that even the music disappeared beneath them. Wherever the Beatles went, chaos followed. Flashbulbs, banners, waves of fans pressing against barricades. It was a tidal wave of love, obsession, and hysteria the world had never seen before. For millions, John Lennon was more than a musician. He was rebellion, wrapped in a smile, wit sharpened like a knife, a voice that seemed to speak directly to the restless hearts of a new generation. On stage, he played it cool, cracking jokes, smirking at reporters, rolling his eyes as if he was untouchable. But inside, something darker was stirring. John was restless. The fame that once thrilled him now felt like a cage. Night after night, he stood in front of screaming crowds that couldn't even hear the songs. The music, the very thing that had once saved him, was being swallowed by the noise. He began to drink harder, to lash out at those closest to him. The pressure twisted into anger, and the old wounds of his childhood, his father's absence, his mother's death, the constant fear of abandonment, rose to the surface. Fame didn't heal those wounds, it only magnified them. The band was burning out too. Constant touring, endless interviews, hotel rooms that blurred into one another. Paul still pushed for perfection. George longed for peace. Ringo carried it with quiet humor. But John was unraveling. His sharpness turned into cruelty, his laughter into bitterness. And then came the words that set the world on fire. In an interview, John, half tired, half provocative, remarked that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. To him, it was a comment on society, on youth, on the strange religion of fame. But in America, it sparked outrage. Records were burned, radio stations banned their songs, threats poured in. John had always craved attention, but now he saw the cost. Fame could build you into a god one day and crucify you the next. Still, the machine rolled on. They recorded in studios. They toured across continents, their music growing more ambitious even as their souls grew more fractured. For John, the laughter of screaming crowds began to sound like a storm he couldn't escape. He was the most famous man in the world, and yet he had never felt more lost. The Beatles stood at the height of their power, but for John Lennon, the higher the climb, the deeper the emptiness. In the next chapter, the stage lights dim, the screaming fades, and John begins to search for meaning beyond the madness. Stay with us, subscribe, and witness the turning point of a legend. The Turning Point. By 1966, the circus of Beatlemania had reached its breaking point. Stadiums filled with tens of thousands. But the music was lost under an endless wall of screams. The Beatles couldn't hear themselves play, and sometimes they barely tried. Concert after concert, the joy was gone. The band that once thrived on raw energy now looked like prisoners of their own fame. Then came the decision that would change everything. No more touring. No more nights drowned in noise. No more running from hotels into armored cars while thousands chased them through the streets. For John, it was a relief, but also a terrifying silence. For the first time in years, he had to face himself without the roar of the crowd to hide behind. Inside the studio, though, something new was happening. Freed from the road, the Beatles began to experiment. The songs grew stranger, deeper, more ambitious. Layers of sound, orchestras, tape loops, music that was no longer about teenage love, but about life, loss, imagination, and the limits of reality itself. For John Lennon, this was both liberation and confrontation. He poured his soul into the songs, writing about his childhood, his fears, his hunger for something beyond fame. Tracks like Strawberry Fields Forever carried the echoes of a boy lost in the garden of his aunt's house, a boy still searching for his mother's face. But even as the music soared, John's life spiraled. Alcohol, drugs, the gnawing emptiness of fame, they all collided inside him. The sharp wit that once charmed the world often turned cruel. His marriage to Cynthia was crumbling under the weight of his restless heart. And then, into this storm, came a woman who would change his life forever, Yoko Ono. At first, she was an artist on the fringes, mysterious and unapologetic. To John, she was something the world could never give him: understanding, reflection, a mirror to his pain. Their connection was instant, electric, and dangerous. John was standing at a crossroads. On one side, the band that had given him the world. On the other, a new path that promised truth, love, and destruction all at once. The stage lights of Beatlemania were gone. The studio was now their cathedral. And in that cathedral, John Lennon was beginning to write a new gospel, one that would either save him or tear everything apart. The Beatles had left the stage behind and stepped into the future of music. But for John Lennon, the silence after the screams was louder than ever. In the next chapter, Yoko Ono enters the story, and with her, the cracks inside the Beatles begin to widen. Don't miss it. Subscribe now and continue the journey into the heart of a legend. Love and fracture. By the late 1960s, the Beatles were gods walking the earth. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band had redefined music itself, and their songs were no longer just pop. They were cultural revolutions pressed into vinyl. But behind the studio doors, the picture wasn't so perfect. John Lennon was restless again. The band that had once been his lifeline now felt like a burden, a routine, a trap. He looked across the studio and saw Paul, ever the perfectionist, driving the sessions with tireless energy. George, quietly frustrated, struggled to have his songs heard. Ringo, steady but weary, tried to hold the peace. And John? John was drifting further away, his eyes fixed on someone new. Her name was Yoko Ono. To many, she was strange, incomprehensible, but to John, she was a revelation. With Yoko, he found an intimacy he had never known. A partner who challenged him, pushed him, and listened to the shadows he carried. Their connection was instant and absolute. For John, it wasn't just love, it was escape, it was freedom. He brought Yoko into the studio, by his side through every session, every rehearsal. To John, it was natural. She was part of his art, part of his being. But to the others, it felt like an intrusion. The unspoken brotherhood of the Beatles was broken. For the first time, they weren't four against the world. They were fractured. Arguments grew sharper. Recording sessions turned into battlefields of silence and resentment. John and Paul, once inseparable, were now rivals. Two men pulling in different directions, each trying to steer the ship. George's frustrations boiled over. Ringo walked out at one point, exhausted by the tension. The music reflected it all. The White Album was brilliant, sprawling but chaotic, a mirror of the storm inside them. Songs were written in separate corners, voices layered without harmony, each Beatle chasing his own vision. Yet amid the chaos, John's voice grew louder, more raw. He poured his love for Yoko into songs, unapologetic and defiant. To him, the Beatles were no longer his entire identity. Yoko was, and with her, he began to dream of a life outside the band, a life where he could speak not just as a Beatle, but as John Lennon, the man. The world adored the Beatles, but inside the studio, the seams were tearing. The greatest band in history was standing on a fault line, and the cracks were beginning to split wide open. The Beatles had given John Lennon the world, but now he wanted something the band could no longer offer: freedom. In the next chapter, the fractures deepen, the dream collapses, and John takes his first steps into a life beyond the Beatles. Subscribe now and witness the fall of a legend's first empire. The end of the dream that had once seemed eternal, was unraveling thread by thread. The Beatles, the band that had conquered the world, were now standing in silence across the studio. Four men divided by resentment and fatigue. The recording of Let It Be was supposed to be a return to roots, a reminder of why they had begun. But instead, it became a mirror of their collapse. Cameras captured the tension. John mocking, Paul frustrated, George simmering in quiet anger, Ringo caught in the middle. The brotherhood was gone. Yet in the midst of this storm, John's eyes were fixed elsewhere. He and Yoko had begun staging their infamous bed-ins for peace, lying in hotel beds, surrounded by reporters, demanding an end to war. To many, it seemed absurd. To John, it was the truest stage he had ever known. Not screaming fans, not flashing cameras, but a message shouted across the world: give peace a chance. And then came the moment that could no longer be avoided. The Beatles broke. No farewell concert, no final bow. Just silence, lawyers, and heartbreak. The greatest band in history ended not with music, but with paper. For John Lennon, it was liberation and loss. The band had been his family, his battlefield, his voice. Now, he was alone with Yoko, standing at the edge of an unknown future. But out of that silence came new songs, songs that bared his soul in ways he had never dared before. Instant Karma, Mother, and then the hymn that would forever be tied to his name, Imagine. A simple melody, a dream, wrapped in words. No possessions, no countries, nothing to kill or die for. A vision of peace that became an anthem for humanity itself. Yet John's life was no fairy tale. Fame still hunted him, politics stalked him, addictions haunted him. He loved fiercely, fought bitterly, and never stopped being a man at war with himself. But through it all, his voice carried, across generations, across continents, across time. On December 8, 1980, the voice was silenced. Outside his home in New York City, John Lennon was shot and killed. The world stopped. Crowds gathered, candles lit, tears fell like endless rain. The boy from Liverpool, who once strummed a banjo in his mother's kitchen, was gone. But his dream was not. His music, his words, his vision for peace, they remained. They still remain. John Lennon's story was one of brilliance and tragedy, of rebellion and love, of dreams and loss. From Liverpool's grey streets to the world's brightest stages, he became more than a musician. He became a symbol. And though his life was cut short, his dream continues to echo. If you believe in keeping that dream alive, subscribe now. Join us as we remember the voices that shaped our world, one silent story at a time.